Yuma, good evening everyone. Very warm welcome to the National Library of Australia this evening. I'm Luke Hickey, I'm the Assistant Director General of our Engagement Branch. Before we get started, if I could just ask if everyone could switch off their mobile phones, or please ensure that they're on silent. Nothing worse than them pinging in the middle of an evening. To begin this evening, I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we're meeting here tonight, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and extend that respect through them to all Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Our borders here, I'm a Canberra boy, born and bred, so it's a great privilege that our borders sit on these beautiful lands, and I acknowledge that ongoing connection that they have to country. The National Library, which holds so much of Australia's history, including that relating to our capital, is pleased to once again host the long-standing Canberra Day Oration. Richard and I were just talking before about how long exactly that might be, but we think at least the last 20 lectures and probably more before them. Our team always really look forward to nights like tonight and looking forward to hearing from Gary. So I've got no doubt that tonight's lecture is going to be as thought-provoking and illuminating as those that have gone before. I'm not going to hog the stage any longer. I'm going to introduce to you Richard Reid, who's the President of the Canberra and District Historical Society, to say a few words. Richard.
Well, thank you for that, ladies and gentlemen, but you don't know what I'm going to say, so I think the clapping might be premature, you never know. And I was going to introduce myself, indeed, as the current president of the Canberra District Historical Society. And if you're impressed, any of you, with tonight's proceedings, are interested in joining the society, we have membership forms and information brochures. When you go out, there's a table to the side with all that stuff laid out. So if you're feeling inspired, please do join us. The Society has been supporting the study and presentation of Canberra and district history since its foundation in 1953. In 2002, we introduced this event. I say reintroduced because such an oration was started by the Department of the Interior on Canberra Day 1961 and lasted in some shape or form, according to the Canberra Times, until at least 1994, perhaps longer. The Times is only on trove to that point, and I haven't researched the hard copy. From 2002, we've had the wholehearted cooperation of the National Library for the venue and general public organisation of this oration. I extend the Society's sincere thanks to the Library for this, because without it, we would have found great difficulty in making the occasion the success it has always been. The event commemorates, recognises that day, 12 March 1913, when Gertrude Trudy Mary Denman, Baroness Denman, wife of the then Governor-General Lord Denman, 3rd Baron Denman, I love that sort of stuff, officially named Canberra on a spot not far from where we sit tonight. Given the eminence of these personages and the importance of that day for our city, it is appropriate that we call this not an address or a presentation, but an oration. Is this not a word equal to the significance of that occasion? The Cambridge Dictionary, and I don't want to frighten tonight's orator, calls it a formal public speech about a serious subject. I'm sure that tonight's oration by a former Chief Minister of the Australian Capital Territory will be serious. And before I call on somebody to introduce our speaker, I was listening on my walk to that fantastic series, you've probably all heard of it, The Past is History. And it was about the coming of the terror in the French Revolution. And given the nature of the question that Mr. Humphries posed himself tonight, I'm wondering if the time hasn't come to set up the guillotine in Garima Place, but we will see. Anyway, I'd like to call upon my friend and colleague, Mr. Gary Kent, who's also a member of our council, to introduce our speaker. Gary.
Thank you, Dr. Reid. I've been given 2 minutes to talk about Gary's career in the ACT, so I'll be very brief and I'll touch on the important points. Gary was born in Sydney, was a solicitor, attended the ANU where he received a Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Laws, private secretary to Senator Amanda Vanstone, member of the ACT Legislative Assembly from 1989 to 2003, served as a minister in the Trevor Kane and Kate Carnell governments, including Deputy Chief Minister, Attorney General, Treasurer and Health portfolios. Opposition Leader, 1991, 2001-2, Chief Minister, 2000 and 2001, Senator for the ACT, 2003, 2013. Gary was president of the ACT Liberal Party from 1987 to 1989. Now, I think I've been chosen to introduce Gary because that was a role I had from 2000 to 2007. And some of the time that Gary was active and operating and leading in the ACT government and assembly, I was given a first-hand view in my role. So I think that's why I was picked. Lots of things I hope Gary doesn't talk about in that history. Gary has had many community activities over the years. I think most importantly, a long-standing and valued member of the Canberra and District Historical Society. Gary witnessed the birth of ACT self-government and, as I mentioned, was a member of that first and subsequent legislative assemblies. I think he was involved as a political advisor in discussions on the form of self-government, but that might come out tonight too. His 10 years as senator would also have given Gary another perspective on self-government in the ACT. Now, before introducing Gary, I'd like to mention that Gary's partner Kathy is here. Always good to see you, Kathy. Thank you for coming along and being a great support act over all of those years. So without further ado, I've spoken already too long. I'd like to introduce Gary. I did overlook the fact that Gary is a PhD candidate at the ANU. His topic is the history of self-government in the ACT, and I think that is the genesis of this evening's lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. Your secrets are safe with me, so don't worry too much. Thank you everyone for coming here tonight, and I hope that I will, for those of you who lived through the period that I'm going to describe, that the experience won't be too scarifying for you. If you do feel the need to weep or scream, please go outside before you do that. On the 11th of May 1989, the Australian Capital Territory became self-governing. It was an important day in Australia's political history, with the first meeting of the fledgling 17-member Assembly, a process that had been begun tentatively in 1823 with the swearing in of the New South Wales Legislative Council, was finally complete. Now, for the first time since 1911, every community on the Australian continent was self-governing. But the 11th of May 1989 was not a day of celebration in Canberra. Self-Government Day arrived not with a bang, but a whimper. There were no parades, no public orations, no fireworks. The Parliament's home was unprepossessing. Just a few weeks beforehand, it had been a government shopfront on the ground floor of the Nara building in Civic. The new MLAs only need to pull back the curtains to eyeball passing pedestrians. They were seated at recycled public service desks dating from about 1940, which had been recently on the scrap heap, but which with a lovely polish were now adequately functional. The office upstairs for Liberal MLAs was the office vacated by the typing pool. Canberra citizenry was not invited or was excluded from the inaugural sitting because the small public gallery was fully occupied by friends and family of the new MLAs. Perhaps it was just as well. It's possible that there might have been rows of empty seats if they had been invited, or if they had attended, that they might have been tempted to interject or throw eggs. Because it was painfully clear to the new crop of politicians that what they and the institution they constituted represented was something that the ACT community did not value. The new Legislative Assembly was resented, disparaged, mocked, and even despised. For those of you who were here at the time, that might have been easy to understand. For those who came later, that level of animosity must be difficult to understand. Opinion polls showed that most Canberrans were opposed to the idea of being self-governing. Letters to the editor of the Canberra Times blistering in their commentary. One correspondent berated brash amateurs with dollar signs in their eyes, while another compared election contenders to monkeys, adding, "No one would wish this mob of candidates on their worst enemy." Someone bemoaned that the hemlock of self-government was about to be forced down our throats. Now, I regret to say that, as an historian myself these days, that professional historians were prominent amongst Canberra's late-blooming democracy, the critics of late-blooming democracy. Professor John Maloney from the ANU condemned self-government as, quote, deplorable and shabby in its conception, implementation and purpose. Bill Mandel, an historian at what's now the University of Canberra, went one further. He lamented that the city would soon be run by poltroons or non-entities, and warned that after the election, voters will be paying for the whole avaricious, freeloading pack of no-hopers forever. If that guillotine that Richard has spoken about was in Grima Place, it would have been used day and night with that mood. It's worth remembering, however, on a serious note, that this wave of aversion to self-government came at a time when there were still liberation movements around the world where people were fighting and in some cases dying for the right to be independent and self-governing. For example, at the time that ACT voters were chorused in lament at the idea of self-determination on Australia's northern doorstep, the people of East Timor were literally dying in their hundreds in their struggle for independence. Here is a map of Nunavut, the territory of the Inuit people of far north Canada. Why do I show this? Because it's the only community in the democratic world I can find that obtained self-government later than the citizens of the Australian Capital Territory. It became self-governing in 1999, possibly so late because only 36,000 people lived there. So how did it come about that the ACT, with 10 times that population, should have been so slow to take this path? Why were ACT residents so viscerally opposed to liberty? The answer lies in the way that the Federal Capital Territory, as it was then called, came into existence. As we know, the concept of a purpose-built national capital city set in the landscape was a resolution of the pre-Federation rivalry between Sydney and Melbourne. That concept smoothed the way for approval of Australian Federation at the 1899 referendum, but like so many theoretical concepts cooked up by politicians to solve a problem, it had different meaning to different people. King O'Malley, King O'Malley disappeared, I'm sorry to say. Never mind. You know what he looks like up on that platform with the Governor General and Andrew Fisher and so on. King O'Malley, sometime Minister for Home Affairs, foresaw the city created by Federation would rival London in population, Paris in beauty, Athens in culture, and Chicago in enterprise. I'm disappointed that you laugh at that comparison. Andrew Deakin, by comparison, had very modest ambitions. He envisaged a mere township for many years, with a largely migratory population that would descend on the city during parliamentary sittings and largely abandon it at other times. The conjunction of other events dictated that the less expansive vision of Canberra would initially prevail. 40 years after its naming, and thanks to 2 world wars and the Great Depression, the city would more resemble a country town than a national capital. It would take Robert Menzies to shake the city out of its torpor and set it on the road to a national capital model, making it a city people would long to visit rather than long to leave. His problem in doing this, however, was the city had a dreadful reputation that only large amounts of Commonwealth money could ameliorate. Senator John Button would talk as late as the 1970s about the sociological wasteland of Canberra, bemoaning working in that white building set in its sweeping crematorium lawns dotted with rose bushes. So to offset that crematorium effect, Menzies set about giving form to an elegant city with amenities second to none. Ample schools, ovals and shopping centres, sweeping green spaces, national institutions befitting a showcase city, roundabouts instead of traffic lights, easy access to the Australian bush. Public servants at last could move from Melbourne to Canberra out of a sense of desire rather than a sense of duty. But the gravy train would eventually come to the end of the line. By the mid-1980s, it was no longer necessary to incentivise public servants to live in Canberra. And in the age of economic rationalism, the bean counters noted with alarm that the Commonwealth was spending 50% more on a citizen of Canberra than it was spending on a citizen of New South Wales or Victoria. To fix that problem would mean winding back spending on the showcase city, and naturally, federal politicians would rather that people other than them made the decisions where the axe would fall. The city's state of pampered infantilism was doomed to end. Canberrans, of course, being well educated and well versed in the wiles of government decision-making, knew exactly what their federal masters meant when they began to talk nobly about self-government. They meant that Commonwealth largesse was coming to an end. They meant that spending on Canberra would be cut and taxes would be raised. And so, by unspoken agreement, the burghers of Canberra banded together to oppose the plan. The unspoken slogan, a twist on that used by the American revolutionaries, was "No representation if it involves taxation." On this basis, we can suppose that if Canberrans had been present at the Boston Tea Party, they would have been fishing the tea chests out of Boston Harbour, not throwing them in. Thus, the association of self-government with the straitjacket of democratic responsibility and fiscal rectitude was what made the concept so very unpopular. Canberra is now a big and complex enough community to have its own urban myths. One of those myths was that the voters here rejected self-government twice at referendums. Sorry folks, there was only one referendum. It happened on the 25th of November 1978, but it was decisive. 63% of voters preferred Proposal C, being present arrangements for governing the ACT continue for the time being. That attempt wasn't really a serious attempt. The minister probably didn't want self-government to happen because it was going to get in the way of plans he had for Canberra. But the attempts made by the Hawke government in the 1980s were deadly serious, and legislation for self-government finally passed a troublesome Senate in November 1988, in a cruel coincidence, 10 years to the day since the 1978 referendum. The apron strings had been cut, or had they? Many believed that the apron strings might yet be reattached. Distressed citizens pondered, what would Mahatma Gandhi have done? On the assumption, of course, that he'd been opposed to Indian independence rather than in favour of it. So a large proportion of the newly but reluctantly liberated citizens of Canberra decided on a form of civil disobedience, that is, to vote insincerely, as some political scientists would label it. Voting insincerely means voting for a party you don't really believe in for the sake of making a point. And so at the election on the 4th of March 1989, the first election, some extraordinary things happened. The longest ballot paper in Australian electoral history was issued, 1 metre, necessary to accommodate the 117 candidates who stood, including the Surprise Party, the Party, and the Sun-Ripened Warm Tomato Party. You see that list of all the candidates and parties there. The two major parties were shunned, receiving respectively the lowest votes either had achieved since 1910. Their vote was cannibalised in part by the No Self-Government Party and the Abolish Self-Government Coalition, parties whose platforms committed their elected MLAs to eradicating the very institution to which they'd just been elected. So did voters achieve their objective of reattaching the apron strings? Well, here's the whole bunch of avaricious, freeloading pack of no-hopers there, looking very proud of themselves. Now, sadly, the MLAs committed to their own hara-kiri were too few in number to accomplish their aim. Indeed, in the case of no self-government MLAs, they didn't even try. In fact, they did a 180. One of their number became the inaugural speaker of the once despised institution. That's him in the red tie on the front row. And another became a minister there on the far right. Their presence, however, did contribute to the fact that there were 3 different governments in less than 3 years. Having failed to abolish the new institution, they had achieved what was perhaps the next best thing. They made it, in the words of one journalist, the laughingstock of the universe. But despite their best endeavours, the institution survived, and survived to this day. But did it thrive? Before I answer this question, I want to emphasise why it's important to ask it. Several studies have shown that the well-being of communities, the sense of confidence people have in their fellow citizens to contribute to a fair and prosperous society, to strive for common good, is linked to the confidence they have in the prevailing system of government. If people feel they cannot affect change through their vote, or that powerful elites control outcomes, or that public officials are corrupt, they are less likely to make sacrifices in the public interest, such as reporting law-breaking, doing military service, or volunteering. Confidence in the system of government is different, of course, to confidence in a particular government or particular parties or politicians. Knowing how citizens appraise their system of government is, I would argue, vitally important in understanding how effective government can be, what traction it can bring to managing complex problems. Now, appraising systems of government is not easy. It's become more complex in recent years because other pillars of society have been wobbling at the same time. There's been a marked but steady decline in trust for many public institutions, including banks, the church, the media and the police. But most conspicuous for the purposes of this talk is the decline in trust in major political parties. Whereas once the major parties could sweep the field, leaving only titbits for smaller parties and independents, today their dominance is severely compromised. The Australian election study, conducted out of our own ANU since 1967, documents this. In 1967, 72% of voters surveyed considered themselves lifelong supporters of their preferred political party. By 2022, that figure had dropped to just 37%. By 2022, just 16% of voters consider themselves stable Liberal National Party supporters and just 12% stable Labor supporters. In line with this trend, Labor was elected to government at the last federal election with less than 33% of the primary vote. Conversely, and at all levels of government, support for minor parties and independents has been growing. These trends are not exclusive to Australia. In the German election recently, the major parties, which had garnered 92% of the vote in previous decades, dropped to just 45% of the vote. My point here is that it's very hard to measure the confidence we have in political systems when confidence in key elements of those systems, such as political parties, is falling dramatically. So the ACT population in 1989 was deeply disaffected with its new democratic institution. It anticipated that disaster, in particular financial ruin, was just over the horizon. So were the worst fears of 1989 realised, or has self-government been a success, contrary to expectations? To take the pulse of our polity, we need to answer that question. Now, the last opinion poll conducted on the question of what people think about self-government happened in mid-1988, quite a long time ago. At that time, 33% of residents only supported self-government. And in case you think that the other 67% have disappeared, I campaigned in the recent ACT election, and on at least 3 occasions, people said to me, "I don't want your bit of paper. I still am angry about the rejection of the outcome of the 1978 referendum, and I haven't voted in an election since. So there are some recalcitrants out there, believe me. In the absence of more recent qualitative opinion polling, I would argue that there are 3 litmus tests which demonstrate that the ACT system of government, 1, is effective, 2, is responsive to the expectations of Canberra citizens, and 3, provides a model of democracy superior to those elsewhere in Australia. The first signpost is the ACT's choice of electoral system for Legislative Assembly elections. Citizens of this city voted at a referendum in 1992 on which electoral system they wanted, single-member electorates or the multi-member Hare-Clark system. By a margin of 2 to 1, they chose Hare-Clark. Citizens were again asked at a referendum in 1995 to approve the entrenchment of that electoral system, and again by a substantial margin they backed Hare-Clark. Now, it's rare for communities to choose their own electoral system by referendum. In 1993, New Zealand did it in a referendum, but that's exceptional. It happened in the ACT because there was much controversy about which system should be used. Indeed, it was disagreement over the electoral system that killed the Hawke government's first attempt to deliver self-government in 1986. At the time of the referendums, the local Liberal Party was being advised by Linton Crosby, now Sir Linton Crosby, one of the world's most recognised political strategists. Linton's advice to us was very clear. He said, Hare-Clark is a complicated system and people won't vote for a system they don't understand. So don't attach yourself to an option which is going to go down in a screaming heap. Now, on this occasion, we ignored that advice. We paid for it, but we ignored it and discovered that people did vote for the system, the mechanics of which they probably didn't understand, but they still recognised as an inherently fair system. Now, at one level, this decision is very surprising. At the 1992 election, voters backed the Labor Party, as they have at most elections, territory and federal, ever since. Yet simultaneously, they voted for in the concurrent referendum for the electoral system which the Labor Party strongly opposed, knowing, surely, that Hare-Clark would make majority Labor governments in the future much more difficult. Why? I think the answer is that voters were priming their political system so that outcomes in terms of votes would be reflected faithfully in outcomes in terms of seats. And so the governments would generally not control the parliament, but would need to be accountable to other parties for their conduct and policies, and could be upbraided and challenged, taken by the scruff of the neck, whenever they made mistakes. Remember, electors were voting at the referendum in 1992, the chaos of the First Assembly, with the 3 different governments, with fluoride taken out of the water supply and then put back in, with MLAs sleeping in their offices, with the Speaker supposedly bitten by a rabid monkey. All of that was fresh in their minds, and it would have been the most natural thing in the world for voters to vote for the system that would exclude those kinds of minor parties and independents, and guarantee strong majority single-party government, but they didn't do that. Despite that recent memory, voters opted for the system in which smaller parties would always have a role and where there would almost certainly be creative tension between government and a parliament it didn't control. Not only that, but in the years since voters have used the Robson rotation feature of Hare-Clark to keep not only parties accountable, but individual MLAs. At every election, cohorts of voters have supported their party of choice, but have kicked out members they didn't consider to be performing and replaced them with different members of the same party. Freed from the binary choice which usually stymies voters elsewhere in Australia, ACT voters have consistently demonstrated they value their system and they know how to use it. This sophisticated interface with the democratic system is hard to discern in other Australian states. The second signpost to a healthy and effective political system is the now well-entrenched habit of electing minority or coalition governments in the ACT. Again, this is not the historical pattern of governments elsewhere in Australia, nor indeed in Westminster-style parliaments generally. The default setting is that governments that win elections get control of the parliament, or at least the lower house of parliament. although exceptions to this default setting have been growing in recent years. So in 2010, when Messrs Windsor and Oakeshott held the balance of power in the federal House of Representatives, the nation held its breath for a few days while they made up their minds. Similarly, minority government is widely forecast to be the outcome of the forthcoming federal election, with the implications of instability and potential crisis if arrangements for a minority government break down. Now, talk of crisis arises because major parties are generally not accustomed to sharing power. Australia does not have a culture of political power sharing. Similarly, coalitions are not part of the political psyche of this country, with the obvious exception of the long-standing coalition between the Liberal and National parties. But ironically, despite that experience, in recent years it has been the Liberal Party which has found it harder to negotiate with the crossbench to form government than has the Labor Party. Tony Abbott passed up the chance for government in 2010 when he was unable to reach agreement with Messrs Windsor and Oakeshott, who held rural seats. Similarly, Jeff Kennett lost government in 1999 because 3 rural independents chose Labor over him. By contrast, look at the successive Labor governments in South Australia. They've been able to duchess National Party MPs and even a former Liberal state leader into ministries in Labor cabinets. But these arrangements remain exceptional, experimental, on the fringe. This stands in stark contrast to the ACT, which has lived with the reality of minority or coalition government almost continuously for 36 years. Only once in that period has a majority government of one party been formed, the Stanhope government of 2004-2008. Minority or coalition government is the norm. MLAs and electors alike are inured to the system. Negotiations on the terms by which minor parties or independents will support minority governments is a now familiar feature in the period following elections, none of which reeks of crisis or instability. With the continued decline of the dominance of major parties, I expect that other Australian parliaments are going to have to adjust to the concept of power sharing, not as the exception, but as the rule. And a culture where party programs are negotiated and compromises on policy reached is one which I believe Australians would regard as an improvement to a democratic system under stress. There's a time when people would accept the maxim that the only good government was a majority government. Give us a majority and we'll fix this problem or that problem. I don't believe most Australians buy that line any longer. I note an opinion poll which was in the Canberra Times a few months ago. Admittedly, this is self-selecting, but if you look at that poll, you see what's interesting about that is that half of all the people responding wanted either a Liberal government or a Labor government, but they didn't want a majority Liberal government or a Labor government. They wanted a government that was constrained by a crossbench which held the balance of power. This reflects a broader anxiety by the Australian electorate with majority governments, an expectation that governments can be challenged or blocked by Parliament, being a better model for managing the body politic. Again, the Australian election study supports that view. It found in 2022 that only 40% of respondents thought the government should control the Parliament. On this indicator, the ACT already has a working model of the system of government which I postulate Australians are seeking. This preference reflects the decline in trust in political institutions generally. If parties and politicians can't be trusted, it's better to share power and dilute the corrosive effect of a single party or block of politicians exercising power exclusively. Of course, such a model already exists also in Western European countries, which are very used to power-sharing governments. And incidentally, lest you might think that minority government is dictated by the electoral system we use, consistent with Duverger's law in political science, consider Tasmania. Tasmania also uses the Hare-Clark system. In the period the ACT has been self-governing, where there's been one majority single-party government, Tasmania has elected not one, not two, but 6 majority governments. So a culture of minority or coalition governments is a combination of two things: an electoral system which permits it and an electorate which habitually votes to achieve it. That culture doesn't exist in Tasmania, but it does exist in the ACT. The third pointer to the health and success of a self-governing ACT is the incidence of corruption in this community. Corruption threatens the legitimacy of the rule of law and is often said to corrode confidence in public institutions. So has corruption lowered confidence in ACT political institutions? Corruption has been a recurring theme in the debate about self-government. Fear of corruption was a significant factor retarding the move to self-government because residents here were reluctant to substitute federal sovereignty over the city, which they saw as efficient and clean, for local government with connotations of councillors and brown paper bags. Such anxieties were stoked by Bernard Collaery, the leader of the Residents' Rally at the first ACT election in 1989. He asserted that cronyism and corruption had been a hallmark of Labor Party administration of Canberra, abetted by public servants in the departments responsible for the city. After being elected to the Assembly, Collaery made further claims of corrupt conduct against ministers in the new minority Labor government. Now, Collaery's failure to substantiate any of these claims, even after becoming Attorney-General in the Liberal-led Alliance government, had a curious effect on the public dialogue around corruption. In an age when investigations elsewhere in Australia were revealing cesspools of graft and corruption, the Fitzgerald inquiry and the Costigan Law Commission being a couple of examples, Collaery's own local hunt had left him conspicuously empty-handed. That failure had a sobering effect on the debate and contributed to the submergence of corruption as a meme of ACT politics for most of the succeeding 2 decades. Politicians and public figures sensed that there was a heavy price to pay for making accusations of corruption, particularly if evidence could not be produced to back up those claims. In a rare exception to this, Trevor Kane, who was by this time an independent MLA, suggested the need for a territorial corruption watchdog in 1999. In response, the Canberra Times thundered, "The ACT does not need an independent commission against corruption, whatever Trevor Kane might think. When such independent commissions have been set up in other jurisdictions, it has been in response to overwhelming evidence of serious, widespread and potentially destabilising corruption, mostly involving police forces. There is not a shred of evidence to suggest these kinds of goings-on in the ACT, either in the Australian Federal Police, in the government, the Assembly or the wider bureaucracy." Now, for a local newspaper, which you might expect would sell more copy when there are stories of corruption running around that they could report on, to make this pronouncement underscores what little threat such issues seemed to pose to Canberra at the turn of the century. When the ACT Integrity Commission, that watchdog he was talking about, was finally set up in 2018, it was the last established of the anti-corruption watchdogs among the Australian states or territories, coming a full 30 years after the first commission, the New South Wales ICAC. But the delayed arrival of the commission wasn't because governments here were resisting calls for such institutions. It was because there was simply no perception of a significant problem with corruption. Even then, its establishment had the air of a precautionary measure rather than a response to an active phenomenon. The Integrity Commission commenced operations in 2019. Last year, it made its first, and so far only, finding of serious corrupt conduct. And that related to certain contracts that were let by the former Chief Executive of the Canberra Institute of Technology. Now, 5 years of operation, 1 finding of serious corrupt conduct. Now, that obviously is a serious development, and I don't wish to downplay it in any way. And it should be regarded as a provisional finding because, in fact, the finding of the Commission is being challenged in the Supreme Court. But I should think that the citizens of the ACT would be entitled to take some comfort from the fact that a third of a century after their system of government was set up, at a time when people were fearing corruption, stalking the new corridors of power on London Circuit, This is the only example of serious corruption to have been established. The fact is that prior to last year, not one minister, politician, senior police officer or senior bureaucrat under the umbrella of the ACT government has ever been found to have behaved corruptly. Not one. In fact, until very recently, none had even been accused of corrupt behaviour. Compare this with the Australian states, which are replete with cases where ministers, politicians, police officers, public officials and developers have been found in courts of law to have acted corruptly, and where many have gone to jail, including a bevy of former ministers. Any other jurisdiction would give its eye teeth to have the public probity record of the ACT. There are several possible explanations for this better performance. I'm not so naive as to imagine that corruption must and will always be discovered. It's possible that in those years when there was no commission that corruption went undetected. It's possible that the watchdog has been now established, has been inattentive or careless. It's possible that witnesses to corruption are too afraid to come forward. But all of these possibilities rank as very implausible. What is much more plausible is that the culture of the ACT system of government makes it much less likely to nurture corruption than systems elsewhere. The fact that governments are routinely accountable to Parliament reduces the likelihood of corruption. The existence of local media focused on the workings of government reduces the likelihood of corruption. A networked and gossipy public service community, where well-informed rumours often preclude public accusations, reduces the likelihood of corruption remaining undiscovered. The fact is that the ACT has a record of clean government that would stand comparison with political systems anywhere else in the world. Even accounting for the innate cynicism with which Australians approach such things, it ought to be a matter we value much more than we do. Let me conclude by quoting Winston Churchill. In 1949, he said, "No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." If there was hesitation about democracy in 1947, there's downright despondency today. Many expected with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism in the early 1990s that liberal democracy would be universally acclaimed. Instead, the voters the world over have become cranky and dissatisfied with the failure of democratic systems to deliver improved living standards or find solutions to complex social problems. When we add to that general restlessness, the Australian tendency to be cynical and distrustful of authority, giving our system of government a good kicking becomes almost irresistible. The truth is, we are far too ready as a society to see the glass half empty, to wring our hands about what we've failed to achieve than to celebrate what we have achieved. I believe we live in one of the most successful societies on the planet and in one of the most successful cities of that superlative society. Some would even say, casting an eye over the other 8 billion human beings in this world, that this here is as good as it gets. Canberra was already a much blessed community when self-government was thrust upon it in 1989. In fact, people feared that with self-government these blessings would fly out the window. But this is an intelligent and resourceful community, and it rose to the challenge that self-government presented. What happened next is that the furnace of public hostility forged a model of government that befitted a model city. Instead of getting angry, the people got creative. The people chose the Rolls-Royce of electoral systems and have used it judiciously, wielding the axe carefully ever since. The people have consistently installed governments which are accountable to other parties or to the Parliament as a whole. No other Australian jurisdiction has done this so consistently for so long. And the people have sustained a culture of openness and accountability which has kept corruption at bay. Again, a record no other jurisdiction can touch. That's not to say our system of government is perfect, far from it. Democratic structures around the world are under stress and are in need of some overhaul, ours included. Nor am I saying that the particular government that runs the territory at present is the best possible government. As you might expect, I campaigned for the alternative last October, and I still think we can do better. But gripes about the government of the day is not the same thing as being unhappy with our system of government. In my opinion, the former leaves a lot to be desired, but the latter is the best in the nation. We live in an uncertain time when the tectonic plates of politics are shifting in unexpected directions. We should be standing by what works, what's effective, and this Canberra Day, we should be celebrating our achievement, the product of a turbulent but transformative early history. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. We do have time for questions. We have one or two roving microphones. If you do ask a question, please speak into the microphone so people at home can hear you. Do I see any hands for a question? Oh. Peter.
I don't have a question. I'm the microphone.
Oh, sorry.
Microphone boy. Oh, well, I see our president, Dr. Reid, has a question. No?
There's a gentleman back there.
Oh, David has a question. Okay.
Is the microphone on?
I think so.
Is it true that in effect the ACT is a republic with neither the monarch or the Governor-General being our head of state, that our constitution is actually an act of the federal parliament? So are we a republic in the ACT?
Yes, is the short answer. Laws are signed into effect by the Chief Minister, not by a Viceroy or Administrator or anyone like that. If there's a hung Parliament, Parliament sorts it out. A Chief Minister becomes head of government by a vote of the Assembly, not by a trip to Government House. So we are in effect a republic. What reflection that makes on the broader debate about an Australian public I won't enter into. But again, it was thought that the ACT should have a lean, mean model when it was set up, and not having a Viceroy was thought to be part of that exercise.
There's one up there.
Got a question. It's about the National Capital Authority. There's a part of ACT which is not controlled by the ACT government. Has that been a problem for the ACT government? And would you think that's... I'm not suggesting we storm the capital, but particularly as we're sitting in it. Is it time for a change with ACT taking control of all of the ACT?
Well, there was a suggestion in the newspaper just in the last week that we should shrink the federal territory to the parliamentary triangle and give the rest of it to New South Wales. So it's being radical is not out of the question in some people's minds. I actually think there is a problem with the fact that the planning of the city is divided between two authorities. And there hasn't been too much obvious friction in recent years, but it's been there in the past. It needs to be resolved. In Washington, I think there's a joint committee of federal and local authorities or local dignitaries who make decisions jointly about the planning of the city, and that works better. We haven't had too many recent issues with that, but there were certainly some fireworks in earlier years, and I think that theoretically having two planning systems or two planning authorities for the one city is not a clean, efficient way of doing it.
Gary, you've just mentioned one potential improvement to our system here, but have you got in mind other potential improvements that we could make to our system?
Yes, I mean, I think the system is in need of overhaul. It does need to be reconsidered. We still have a kind of a representative democracy model, a la medieval England, when someone was chosen, a prominent citizen was chosen to go to London and sit in the House of Commons and represent that district. Whereas I think that today, given the interconnection of citizens through the internet and the ease of travel and so on, perhaps more of the Athenian concept needs to be introduced into our system. So I think that giving people a choice at elections, well, it's a wider choice in the ACT than elsewhere, a choice about which party to be elected to government. You buy all of its policies or none of them. There's no chopping and changing. It's a blunt instrument, and it's helping make people less satisfied with the system. We introduced, when we were in government, citizens-initiated referendum legislation, because we thought that that was one way of addressing those hot points of contention that governments weren't, in some people's opinion, adequately dealing with. Deliberative polling has been talked about recently as a way of resolving difficult, complex questions. Get a jury of citizens into a room, intensively educate them about what the issues are, and then ask them to vote on what should be done. There are ways of dealing with a society which is more sophisticated, but better educated, better informed than it's ever been, that would overcome some of the difficulties we're facing with our democratic system.
Thank you for that excellent address, Gary. The ACT does suffer from diseconomies of scale. We've got the accoutrements of state and local government in a relatively small geographic area and a relatively small population. There have been talks about, farming the ACT off to New South Wales, but a much better idea, of course, is to actually expand the ACT and grow our population base. In fact, I think we've on the verge of acquiring a little bit of land off in West Belconnen anyway. But what do you think about the proposal to get better economies of scale, a more economic strength by taking over the capital region?
The new ideas are flying thick and fast tonight. Look, I think there's certainly merit in adjusting our borders. I think it's silly that we're butting up against the northern borders of the territory, and we're going to have a situation a bit like Washington, where parts of Washington are really in Virginia and Maryland, and they should be part of Washington. We want to avoid that if we possibly can. And I used to think that we sorted this problem out through the adjustments that the Commonwealth Grants Commission makes, but discovered recently that's not the case. So when a person crosses the border from New South Wales to use one of our hospitals, there's an payment made through the Grants Commission process to the ACT to account for that person. But the incidence of service that they receive is subsidised in that exercise at a national standard rate of cost, not at the actual cost of that person's care in the hospital. So we are subsidising, in fact, citizens of New South Wales who come across the border to use our services, schools, hospitals, whatever. That's not a good arrangement, and I think some rearrangement of the borders would be a good idea. But I don't want the headline of tomorrow's paper to be, Anschluss with Queanbeyan or anything like that. So thank you for the suggestion.
Can you hear me? Gary, I think you might have been the person who came up with the idea of local planning committees in this city. Is that correct?
Local planning, LAPACs, local area planning committees, yes.
Which enabled elected citizens to have very in-depth discussions with planners and developers about the larger developments in their particular areas. They're long gone since the Liberal government lost in this city. Do you have any observations about citizen contributions now with regard to planning?
LAPACs were a good idea, weren't they? They were. Look, planning is inevitably going to be a sore point, and no community in Australia, possibly anywhere else in the world, which is facing rapid need for development, with growing populations, has been able to solve that problem. I believe you've got to give people an active voice, but you also need to delineate where and when consultation ends and decisions have to be made. And I think whereas there are certainly occasions when people's views have been overridden and ignored, and there's not been enough dialogue at that sort of sit down around a table and talk about proposals level. But there have also been occasions where some decisions have dragged on for decades, literally decades, before being made because of processes that slow down reaching a decision. We haven't got that right. It's 25 years since I was planning minister, so I'm not sure what the solution is, but it needs to be serious consultation with a strict program to reach and make a decision on how planning of a complex community like this goes on in future.
Time for one or two more. Dr. Reid.
This is probably a bit of a stupid question, but I'll ask it anyway. At some point in the future, it's not inconceivable that the ACT will have a larger population than one of the founding states, Tasmania. There'd be a larger population. So then we're going to reach a point when, you know, all the founding states all had 6 senators. 6, is it 6 or 12?
12.
12, sorry, 12 into the national parliament. But we now have the situation where a territory is actually bigger, population-wise, than one of the founding states. Is that going to raise issues about representation, do you think?
As we know, altering our constitution is sort of almost impossible. So that preference that is given to originating states, you know, can't be reversed. If the Northern Territory had become a state when they had a referendum a few years ago, they would have been entitled to, you know, assessment of their needs, but it wouldn't have been on the basis of the original states. They wouldn't have had 12 senators, for example. Look, that historical anomaly is never going to go away. I don't think, you know, ganging up on Tasmania is ever going to, you know, get the support of enough states and enough voters to make it happen. But we can adjust, we can make adjustments, and I know there's been debate about having more senators in the ACT. It does produce an anomaly. If we had 4 senators here, say, rather than 2, we'd be much better, much more fairly represented by comparison with Tasmania, but quite grossly overrepresented by comparison with New South Wales. So you don't win with these things. I still think the quality of the representation is more important than the volume.
One more question and then we're finished. Amanda. Oh, sorry, there was one. Ernst. We'll take 2. I mucked that up. We'll take 2.
Thank you. Can I follow up the very first question, which was similar to a question I was going to ask, but raise the issue in a slightly different way? In light of your experience as Chief Minister without a governor and your experience in the Senate, where at the federal level we do have a Governor-General, do you think that the offices of Governor and Governor-General are now superfluous? Can we manage government without an office holder over and above the Premier or the Prime Minister?
We were close to a situation in 1991 where you might have wanted an administrator. That's what it would be called in the ACT's case, an administrator. We just had the second change of government. Rosemary Follett had come back into office as Chief Minister, but she only had 5 seats in a 17-member assembly. The other parties were disintegrating. There were 7 or 8 different parties in a 17-member assembly at this stage. It was chaotic. And if you'd been a state premier, you would almost certainly have gone to Government House and said, dissolve this mess and we'll have a fresh election then and there. But Rosemary didn't have that option, so she had to endure for another 9 months. So in that particular situation, having somebody to diffuse the bomb would have been useful. But does that mean having one all the time is necessary? I'm not so sure. I would think the idea of a kind of a citizen administrator, someone who didn't have a big house somewhere and lots of staff and so on, but was a senior person in some other role and had the extra duty of being the administrator of the territory, whose job it was to deal with a problem like that, could work. It's sort of a compromise halfway house. And even a president in a Republican situation would have to deal with those sorts of issues. So we are possibly too much of the sort of, having deleted that vice-regal role, possibly to our disadvantage. But on balance, it's working fairly well, and I think crises like that will be quite rare.
Last one, Amanda.
Thank you. Gary, from your perspective of being a senator and also a leader in the ACT Assembly, what are your views on the federal? I know you've been outspoken about the federal government overriding legislation in the ACT. So is there some sort of moral imperative that they should not just back off, even if they're tempted to interfere? And I'm just interested in your views on that.
Oh, look, I've taken the view. I mean, having argued, for self-government, and having worked hard to persuade a very reluctant population that this is a good thing, we've come a long way and we should be, making the most of our right to make our own decisions, to then be told by the federal government that it knows better, or the federal parliament, it knows better, it'll tell us what to do, is just not going to work. And when we have a system in Australia where we say that, people at state level are entitled to make decisions about schools and hospitals and police forces and so on, we think that's the right level at which those decisions should be made. It doesn't mean that because you're in a territory that there's somehow a different consideration. If it's good enough for a citizen of New South Wales to decide how many schools there should be in their area, it's good enough for a person in the ACT. But I think we've come a long way since then, and without sort of, being too sort of political about my own experience, at the last federal election, the Liberal senator put to the voters a proposition that would have sat very well with the opponents of self-government in 1989. He said the federal parliament knows best about what to do with euthanasia, voluntary assisted dying, in the ACT. It's not for the ACT politicians to decide. The federal politicians know better and they should make that decision. And now, 1989, people would have said, yeah, that's a good idea. In 2022, it didn't fly quite so well and he lost his seat. And I think that indicated that people actually had said, we didn't think this model was so good at start. We didn't really want the idea of local politicians running the place. But we actually think now we've got it right, and that's where the decision should be made.
Thanks, Gary, so much for that. Not only the thoughtful and balanced address, but for also talking down the hostile takeover of Queanbeyan tonight. So I think we can all sleep a little bit easier. We're really looking forward, I think, to the publication of your research in due course, and of course as a former member of our National Library of Australia Council as well, we trust that you know what to do with those papers when the time comes as well, and so we're looking forward to that as well. Look, thank you all for coming out this evening. I trust that you've enjoyed a bit of a trip down memory lane for some, but also really interesting insight, not only from a political insider's perspective, but from that historical perspective and that historian's research as well, into how and why Canberra operates the way that we do. Thanks to Richard and Gary and to all of the committee at the Society as well. We're really looking forward to supporting your event again next year. Thanks everyone for coming and have a great night.